Is anybody not familiar with a balanced leech at all? Have no idea what it is? Perfect. For those of you who don't know, this is going to be an amazing fly for you to use, especially if you fish still water. Phil Rowley and Brian Chan are big advocates of the balanced leech as well. A lot of think Phil Rowley was kind of the innovator, but it was actually a guy from Washington, brought it up to Canada, and then Brian Chan and Phil Rowley kind of made it their thing after that. And ever since then, it's been a still water magic tool for me. A lot of our big fish during slower times of the year come off these balanced leeches. So what I'm going to do here is I have a 90-degree jig hook. This is a size 8 mustad. Again, pinch the barb. And then what I have here also is this is a finishing nail. You can use, there's different types of nails you can use. Here, this one right here is another finishing nail. You can get them at Home Depot, Hobby Lobby. For smaller ones, these pins work really well, but depending on the size of the weight you use, the pin will sometimes slip out of that small part of the eye there. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this gold finishing nail here. A lot of times you have to cut these down to size to add extra weight. And what's going to make this balanced is what we're going to do is put the weight in front of the eye of that hook. And by doing that, get another bead. We're going to slide the bead onto this pin. And I actually like to go a lot of the times backwards with the big opening first. So it looks like this. And what I'm going to do with that is same thing. I tie my base layer, get those wraps in, and I'm going to tie this to the bottom of that hook shank to where this bead is about a bead length away from the eye of that hook. If it's too short, that'll be, when it sits, it'll be hook heavy. If it's too far out, then it'll be too front heavy, and these tend to move after I tie them. But if I just go about the width of the bead, maybe a little bit smaller, off the front of that eye, really want to secure this. Right, so now we have this heavy weight. This, I believe, is a 4mm tungsten. When you're tying these balanced leeches, you always want to use tungsten. If you use brass or any other material, it's going to sit hooked down. And the reason these are called balanced is if our line is coming down here, our eye of the hook is here, and because of this weight in the hook, the fly is going to sit perpendicular to the line or parallel to the bottom. So anytime that line moves, the fly is going to come up and then sink back down. And we're getting that jig motion from it being hung this way. So like I was saying, this is how it's going to sit if you don't use tungsten under the water. So from here, we can just kind of continue on to that little back right before the bend. This one we'll do olive. And the same thing with the tail of the beetle. I want to tie these tails fairly sparse. I want a lot of movement in these. So the nice long strung marabou, there's probably maybe 10 strands in there. And we're going to wrap that body with dubbing so we're not super worried on that part right there. And having this light, nice long tail is going to add a lot of movement when these are underwater. And one thing we really got to think about when we're tying these balanced leeches, especially a lot of the times we're fishing them under indicators, is everybody ties them like streamers, but when it's sitting like this and it's not being pulled or there's no current against it, it's not going to fish like a streamer. All that material, that's if you have really dense material, all of it's just going to sink and it looks like a big clump of fly tying material in it. So when I tie these, I want to be really cautious as to how much material I'm putting onto this body and also where that material's laying. Because if I put a really big long collar of this dubbing and it just sits there and it's sitting like this underwater and we're getting a little bit of wave movement or stripping movement, all that material is just going to hang and dangle down and not look like that bait fish pattern we're supposed to. So I got a nice long tail there. I'm going to create my dubbing loop. Oop. If it doesn't slip off the back there. And then once I have my loop, I'm going to bring it all the way up to the front. Now I really tie these fairly sparse. We're not getting big clumps and it's nice and spread out even there. So this is a peacock dubbing right here. Definitely one of my favorites. I actually caught the biggest fish, my personal best, out at Pyramid on a peacock balanced leech. So it's nice and loose. You can see that the fibers are sticking out quite a bit. We still want movement, but we don't want too thick of a body there. So I'm going to spin that nice and tight. Make sure we're kind of spread out there, nice and even. But I'm still splayed out. I have a lot of these fibers sticking out. So once I get it nice and tight, I'll even come in with the dubbing brush after. Perk some of those up. And then from there, I'm going to start that wrap. Still, again, pulling those fibers back so when we lay them down, they're on that backward facing. And again, big red collar for those exposed gill plates. So this right here is what I'm talking about. Right, so if I'm tying a streamer, this would be nice because this is going to be nice and pushed back when I'm stripping it. But when this is laid down and I'm fishing it, much slower or with an indicator, which how these are normally going to be fished, all this material is just going to hang like that. If you can imagine it, it actually sits up that way, but all this material would just hang there and by no means looking appealing to that fish coming by. So again, I'll wrap that, make a nice big exposed collar there. And again, that's going to add durability and it's going to add that red accent exposed gill plate. And it looks silly on these thick collars, but like I said, these are tried and true ways of tying these. For Pyramid Lake specifically. I'm not sure, you know, as far as I've pretty much tied these anywhere else I've fished them and they've worked great. But pyramid specifically, having the red eye or that red collar is a really, really big ticket. So what I'm going to do is brush this out. I'm going to find some of those longer fibers, especially towards that bottom. I'm actually going to clip these down, pull a few out. And particularly on the bottom is where we don't want a lot of those hanging fibers. Some on the sides and some on the top is going to be all right. But when these get really long on the bottom, like I said, they like to hang and you essentially look like you're just a big piece of algae off that bottom there. And I get real specific, and I'll play with these a lot underwater too, to make sure I have that same taper, that natural teardrop taper as all bait fish and small creatures do. So the eye of the hook is right there. And I'll show you an example of this. And we'd much rather have them being front heavy than back heavy. Because if it's back heavy, you're not getting that movement that's needed. I'm just going to hang this on this thread here so those of you can see. Notice how it's just slightly front heavy there. Every time it gets pulled up, it's going to move up and it's going to wiggle down and move up and wiggle down. And a lot of the times we're fishing these under indicators, because when those fish, if they're few and far between and we're not getting big schools coming through those ledges like we normally are, we're waiting for a couple big fish a day that might be cruising that ledge. If we're fishing a balanced leech right on the other side of that ledge, we're getting the big waves from pyramid, fishing heavy indicator rigs. Every time your indicator goes up and down, that fish is going up and down, and we can just jig these flies right along that ledge, waiting for those fish to come by. Very effective pattern. And like I said, a lot of these don't look the prettiest, but the way that they're tied, myself and my other guides have been doing a lot of experimenting with all the small aspects of these flies here. And same way you could tie these with the EP fiber. I've done that plenty of times. It works great. You can trim it down really nice. Any sort of dubbing combo. And we'll tie these anywhere from 10s and 8s all the way up to big balanced bait fish in size 2s and 4s. You know, really big cone head, tungsten beads, large finishing nails, and by the end they're about, 3 to 4 inches sometimes, fishing that way. And a lot of the way we fish out at Pyramid is with switch rods when we're indicator fishing. Because of fishing heavy flies, the chironomids we fish are weighted heavy chironomids are size 6, around size 6 and 8. A lot of times we'll have double tungsten beads on them, and that weight is to help keep everything straight when we're fishing with indicators. So we'll fish our indicator, a really large midge for that weight, and then our point fly, whether it be a balanced leech or a smaller nymph or chironomid. But we're always fishing a bigger top fly, just so when we have our indicator, if we're tight to that indicator as possible, then whatever feeling or any sort of movement we get, that indicator is going to sense that. If our indicator is weighted properly, and we have that heavy fly, we're strictly from there, and then our point fly is at the bottom. Even if our point fly is nice and light floating around, we can actually still see that take if our main fly is really heavy, even if it's floating out here and it gets touched, and then that indicator's down.